Hi, I'm Glyn Dewis. Welcome to episode 32, and this week I want to show you how in Photoshop you can very quickly and easily go from this to this. Okay, so rather than wait for the perfect day, the perfect hill and the perfect location, I've just come for a short 5-minute walk from my front door across some of the local farmers' fields, and this is the hill that I've chosen where I'm going to add in my tree. Now I know that maybe before now I could have just taken a photograph of any old tree and added it in, but with the update to Photoshop on the Creative Cloud now, this new pattern fill, we've got some trees in there, I can actually use some of the settings to design the tree to look exactly how I want it to look. So we're going to start off in Lightroom then, and here's just a selection of pictures that I took whilst out on that walk. This is one of the hill. I've cropped this one in quite tightly just so it leaves that particular part of the top of the hill there in the lower third-ish part of our picture. We've got a little bit of a building over here on the right-hand side we need to get rid of. But while I was out, I also took just a few pictures here to show some of these birds of prey that we have in the area called red kites. All I've done to these pictures here is just brighten them up, brighten the shadows, just so the birds stand out just a little bit more. But we're going to concentrate first of all on the picture of the hill. What I want to do is just bring out some drama in this. We've got some great clouds, so to add some drama to them, I'm going to get a gradient, and I'm just going to go to the gradient and I'll increase the clarity, and we'll drag down right from the top all the way down to cover all the sky. Once we've put that gradient in, we can then in real time come in and affect these sliders just to add or decrease the amount of clarity we want in there. But I'm going to take it right up, and I think I'm going to actually duplicate that because we need more we can get out of there. So I'm going to put my cursor over the little pin, right click where it says duplicate, and that'll give me a little bit more of a punch. I'll get a brush, get the adjustment brush now, and I might actually brush in some clarity as well. So let's just put a brush just over that part of the clouds. Again, just increase or decrease it. And this area here of the sky, this is where I want my light source to be. So I'm going to get a new brush, keep the clarity fairly high, increase the exposure just a little bit, increase the size and make sure it's feathered to 100%, and I'll just paint in just a little bit in that area there. It's not going to do much, but it's just going to add a little bit more punch to that one particular part of the sky, because that's where the main light source is going to be coming through the clouds. Okay, so that's the sky. I'm going to add a little bit more interest now to the ground. So again, I'm going to get a gradient, increase the clarity, drag up from the bottom, hold down my shift key so it comes up nice and straight, something like that. Might bring down the exposure a little bit, but we can really bring up the clarity and just a little bit of sharpening. So not much that we need to do in Lightroom. Obviously playing around with all these things at the moment, bringing out the clarity, increasing the shadows, has brought in quite a bit of noise. So one thing I might do as well before we dive over into Photoshop is do just a little bit of noise reduction. Not going to take it all out because we are adding textures in later onto the picture, and if I bring up the noise reduction too much, it's also going to flatten out the detail that we're getting in the grass. So just a touch, make sure that plenty of detail is being shown through. So that's about right. I don't think, looking at the picture now, I can see any kind of dust specks or anything that need to be removed from it using the healing brush. So what we can do now is dive straight over into Photoshop. So I'm going to go to the photo menu, edit in and choose edit in Adobe Photoshop CC. There's not enough in this picture for me to warrant going over as a smart object. It's only taken a minute or two, so I'm just going to head over into Photoshop as a box standard layer. So now that I'm in Photoshop, one of the first things I want to do is to remove these little tracks here from a tractor that has obviously been going up and down the field. So I'm going to add a blank layer. I'm going to get my clone stamp tool over in the toolbar here, making sure that the hardness is way down. Not completely at 0, but we'll go for around about 10%, something like that. And then increase the size of it. And I'm just going to click and sample and start painting over areas of the grass to cover these tracks here. Now when I do this, I tend to do maybe a couple of samples from one side of the track, and then I'll go the opposite side. And I keep kind of diving over from one side to the other so that we don't get too many repeating patterns. Now you might wonder, if you're a regular Photoshop user, why I wouldn't be using something like the content aware fill. Well, when I actually did this picture, I did try that. Tried it a couple of times. What I tended to find was when it was covering these tracks, it did tend to smooth out some parts of the grass. So we lost quite a bit of the detail. So I'm just finding that doing this particular way works really well for this picture. And the great thing is, because I've put this kind of the samples here, let's just zoom in just at the top here. I'll decrease the size of the brush and we'll just cover over those bits right at the very top there. What's good about this particular technique is because these actual areas, these sample areas are on their own layer, if we just go to that's what these bits here, if they do smooth out at all, I can always go to the filter, noise, and add just a small amount of noise, just 0.5 pixel radius of noise will bring back a bit of detail in that grass. But let's just zoom out, let's just go over to the other side, very quickly just get over these tracks here. So I'll sample a couple of times from one side of the track, then I'll go the other side as well, just to prevent from having any kind of repeating patterns. We're going to be adding some textures onto this picture later on, so I'm not going to be too fussed as if I was going to be doing a picture where no texture was going to be added, but it's also, by doing that, it's going to hide over quite a lot of the imperfections. So we don't have to be too fussed about how brilliant this particular bit of cloning looks. So let's just quickly remove them. Very, very quickly painting over those there just to get rid of these. Nice and tight. Let's come right to the top, sample here, and we'll just paint across. Decrease the size of the brush, and we'll just sample in that bit area there as well. Okay, let's just zoom out. Oh, there's this little bit down here I've missed, so bring up the brush, painting over these, just to get rid of them very, very quickly. It's a great clone stamp tool for sampling all the texture of the grass and bringing it over. But like I say, just be careful not to get too many repeating patterns. So something like that. That'll be fine. Okay, one little bit need to do now as well over on the right hand side here, just to remove this bit of the building. So I'm going to decrease the size of my brush. I'm going to put my little sample here right over halfway into the sky and onto the hill. Hold down my Alt or Option key, click, and then I can see within that sample area there now what my clone source is going to be. So I'll line it up with the top of the hill, somewhere around about there, and then I can quickly come in and paint that away. So increase the size of the brush. Clicking, lifting the brush up and then pressing down again just to clone over something like that. Okay, so that's tidied the image up. The next thing I think is probably to bring the tree in. Okay, so before we bring the tree in, let's just rename this layer, and I'll call this clone because that's where we've cloned out all the grass. I'll then add a blank layer, and then with the new update to Photoshop CC, when we've gone to version 14.2 on the Creative Cloud, within the fill menu, when we in the contents area here choose pattern, we also get another option down here for scripted patterns, and one of them in here is tree. So I'm going to click OK. When I do that, this dialog box here comes up, and this is great. We can choose all kinds of different trees from the menu tree type here, but I'm going to stick with an elm tree. And then we can sort of decide by using these sliders how much foliage, how many leaves we want on this tree. But I want this to be a tree that's got absolutely nothing on it. But we've also got an option here at the top here called light direction, and you'll be able to see in this little preview here, this gives you an idea of where the light source is. Now you'll remember when we first of all did the work in Lightroom, I said that the light source was virtually in the dead center of the picture. So all I'm going to do, although you see a very, very small amount of difference with this, I'm going to set the light direction here to 90. So it's right above our tree, so you can see in the arrow here, the arrow is representing our tree, and the light source by this little sun symbol is directly above it. You'll probably see very, very little difference in the big preview on the tree and here, but I think if it's there, we might as well do it. So there's nothing much else I need to do at the moment. I'm going to click OK. That'll work for a few seconds or so, and then it'll bring the tree over into Photoshop. So now that our elm tree has been brought into Photoshop, let's just get the move tool. Obviously it needs a couple of things that need to be done to it. It needs to be resized. So let's just go to edit and free transform. Get the transform handles, hold down the shift and alt or shift and option key so we can scale it all in proportion. And I think we'll probably go for something like that. Let's just move it around. Probably around about that kind of size there. In fact, I want it to be exactly in the center of my picture. So let's get a guide. I'm going to go to view, new guide, and when the dialog box comes up here, it's already set in vertical. Where it says position, I'm going to type 50 and percent, and that's going to put a guide right down the center of my picture. So now on the tree layer, I can use my left arrow key and I'm going to push the tree so the middle of the trunk is right on that middle guide there. So that's fine, and we can get rid of that guide. I might make the tree just a little bit smaller, so let's go back to free transform and let's just bring the tree down just a touch more, something like that. Press V and we'll bring it down just so that the bottom of the tree is just on that part of the hill. Now at the moment that doesn't look like it's really blending in that well, so what we need to do is just mask away some of it. So first of all I'm going to rename this layer to tree. Then I'm going to add a layer mask. I'm going to get a brush, making sure that my foreground colour is set to black. Then I'm going to come to the very top here and I'm going to choose one of the default brushes that's within Photoshop. And number 134 is this kind of like little three-pronged blades of grass here. So I'm going to click on that, go to the brush options and just take out all the settings. I don't want to be any difference. We can see in the preview down the bottom here what this brush effect is like. The only thing I want to do is go to the brush tip shape and just change the spacing so that there is definitely a difference there. There's a definite sort of gap in between each of these different brush heads, these different blades of grass. So let's just close that down. The opacity I'm going to take to 100%, using the left bracket key, bring it all the way down, and I'll just paint away just on the bottom of that trunk. Now it's going to be such a small difference, but this is going to look much more realistic than had I used just a nice soft edge brush. It's going to help it to blend in a lot better. So now we can see, let's just zoom out. Looks a lot more realistic the way that it's blending in. So I'm liking that. I'm going to click on the thumbnail of the actual tree now. The colouring's not right, but I'm just going to darken it down by going to Image, Adjustments and Levels. We'll get the mid-tone slider and we'll just drag it to the right just to darken the tree down. Not quite a silhouette, but certainly the majority of the way down there. So somewhere around about there's fine. And we'll click OK. So the next thing I'm going to do, because we've got this light source above the tree coming straight down, we're definitely going to need some kind of a shadow on the floor. So what I'm going to do is add a blank layer. I'm then going to hold down my command key and just click once on the thumbnail that contains our tree over in the layers panel. And when I do that, you'll see that it loads it here as a selection. We can see all these marching ants. Now that we've got that, I can then just go to Edit, Fill, and from the drop down menu here of the contents, I'm going to use black. Click OK, and then we'll go select and deselect. So now for turning every other layer off, we can see we've got this black tree here. So while I'm active on that tree, on that layer, let's just rename it to shadow. Oops, make sure the spelling's right. Name it to shadow. Then I'm going to go to edit and free transform. Get the handles up and drag the top layer down all the way down to around about there. Something like that's looking good. And we'll enter. Let's just zoom in, get my move tool by pressing V and just position that up just a little bit more like so. Now let's move out. Now, if a light source was coming down onto this tree, the actual shadow wouldn't be the exact same proportions. It would definitely be wider at the bottom. And this kind of stuff you'll notice if you're walking around, just look at shadows on the floor and you'll get to see how they behave. So to do that, I'm going to go to Edit, Transform and Perspective. And I'm just going to click on one of the handles here and we'll drag it outwards. So that's going to stretch the perspective of our tree now, just so that it's not perfectly the same size as the original tree. This is meant to be a shadow. Something like there is fine. I'm then going to go to Filter, Convert for Smart Filters, because the next thing I want to do is add a little bit of blur. So go Filter, Blur and Gaussian Blur. I only need a small amount, around about 2.5, something like that maybe. That's looking good. click OK. Let's just zoom in just a little bit more. That's looking fine. And then to finish that off, I'm just going to lower the opacity of that layer right down now to something like about 35-ish%. Yeah, something like that. In fact, let's just go a little bit lower. Just doing this by sight. It just needs to be something there. If there was no shadow, it just looked like the tree has been planted and was kind of floating there. So just adding some kind of a shadow does add just a little bit more realism for when you're looking at it. So yeah, something like that's looking good. Now the next thing I want to do is to bring in those birds of prey, the red kites, so that we have a few of them circling around above the tree. So I'm going to head back over to Lightroom, and over here in the grid view you can see that I've got a few of these pictures of the birds that I caught flying around. I think it's actually the same bird, and I just took a few shots of it just to get different angles. So while I'm in the grid view, I'm going to click on the far left one, shift and click on the furthest one, and then press Command or Control E to send all 4 of these pictures over into Photoshop. And then when they're in Photoshop, all I need to do is just zoom in onto one of them. We'll just choose this bird first of all, get my lasso tool and make a very, very rough selection around the bird so that we include a little bit of that sky. And then with my move tool, I'll just click within those marching ants, click and drag so I can bring this over into my picture. Now obviously at the moment it's a bit big, so we can go to Edit, Free Transform, hold down Shift and Option or Shift and Alt to scale it in proportion, bring down the size of the bird to something around about there is fine, get my move tool and reposition it. Now we don't need to do any kind of cutout because on the layer now that contains this bird, in fact let's just rename it to bird 1. Just to the right hand side of that name over here in the layers panel, when I double click that brings up the layer style dialog box, and at the very, very bottom third we have the blend if sliders. Now the great thing is the sky behind the birds here as I was photographing them has definitely gone to like a grey colour, so I can use the top slider here, top here far right, and I drag this over. Keep an eye on the bird here in the picture. As I bring this slider over you'll start to see that that grey around the bird disappears. But if I go too far you'll notice that the grey disappears, but it's very, very jaggedy, and you can see that it's obviously been removed but not very, very smoothly. So to smooth out that transition between the background disappearing and our bird, I can just hold down my Alt or Option key and click on the slider that I moved over. That then splits in two, and I can just separate the two, and just by eye I can just help it to blend in just a little bit more. So something like that's fine. So very, very quickly I can cut the bird off the background. There's the before and there's the after, and click OK. Now I'm just going to jump forward. I'm going to add in a few more birds and then we can carry on with the retouch. Okay, so I've only added in 3 birds as opposed to 5 in my original picture, but you get the idea about how quickly and easy it is to do that. Over in the layers panel, we've got our 3 layers containing the birds. So to keep things nice and tidy, up one selected, shift, click on the bottom one, then go to the flyout menu, new group from layers, and we'll call that group birds. Everything's nice and tidy. Now the next thing I want to do is do a black and white conversion. Now there's lots of ways we can do black and whites, but one of my preferred methods is using Google's Nik Silver Effects Pro 2. Now if I was going to do this normally, what I would have to do is create a merged or combined layer at the top of the layer stack, but that's going to be destructive retouching. Anything I'll do after that I'd have to redo if I wanted to make any changes further on down the layer stack. So that we can work non-destructive and all the layers remain available to me, with the upper group here selected, I'm going to hold down my shift key and then click on the background layer. When they're all selected, again I'm going to go to the flyout menu, but this time I'm going to say convert to smart object. Now Photoshop does a very, very quick calculation and then creates one layer where all the layers are still visible, but they're contained inside this one layer now over here in the layers panel. It's kind of like the Russian dolls where everything gets piled one inside the other inside the other. They're still there, but they're hidden within each other. Okay, so now then I'm going to go to the filter menu, go to Nik Collection and Silver Effects Pro 2. And this is great. We can use plugins by third-party companies like Google and Topaz, which are ones I typically use. We can use them non-destructively, but we can also use them as smart filters and then go back in and make changes. Now all I'm going to do here on the presets, the one that I want to use is High Structure and Harsh. I'll click on that. This is the look it gives me on the screen here, and then I'm just going to click OK to send that back over into Photoshop. Lots of noise being added in here, but I'm quite happy with that. This is the kind of look that I want, but I don't want it to be completely black and white. I need to desaturate it. Over in the layers panel now, there is only one layer. If I just close up the smart filter here, there is only one layer. So I can't use opacity because that'll make my picture disappear. However, when we've used smart filters, we do get this little icon just in the bottom right hand corner. If I double click on that, it brings up a little dialog box that allows me then to dial in the opacity, or the strength if you like, of the filter that I've just applied. So here it says opacity. Click on that, bring the slider, and I'm going to take it down to around about 60%, something like that, and then click OK. And the great thing is that's always available to us. Now I want to give this picture that aged, weathered kind of look. So what I am going to do is go to something that you'll have probably seen in a previous episode, and that's Adobe Exchange, which is available from the window menu. From within there, I've downloaded and installed Adobe Paper Texture Pro. So I've got loads and loads of free textures available to me now. So all I'm going to do is just randomly click on a few of them to add them onto my picture, and you can see straight away the kind of look that's going to give me. And all I'm going to do is just go through adding more and more, changing the blend mode on some of them, and also changing the opacity over here in the layers panel to see what kind of effect I can build up. So that's one of them been done. Let's just go down here. Let's just choose this one, click on it. If it brings in too much color, what I'll also do is click on the thumbnail and then Shift Command U to desaturate it, just so that I'm left with the texture as opposed to the coloring. And then I can bring down the opacity like so. So again, I might just add a couple more, then we'll jump forward with the retouching. So just jumping forward is I've just added just a couple more of these textures, but now I've added enough. I'm going to close that. All these textures over here in the layers panel now, top one selected, shift click so they're all selected, and again put all these into a group. So new group from layers, we'll call that texture. And now you can see when I turn that on and off the kind of effect that's having. Now just a couple of things I want to do to finish this picture off. I want to sort of darken down, maybe add a little bit of a vignette and then a little bit of blurring. So again, I want to do this non-destructively. So what I'm going to do is just put both of these layers now into a smart object. So convert to smart object. And then once Photoshop's done that, I think first of all, I'll go to filter and choose camera raw filter. That'll bring me into camera raw. So then I'm just going to use the radial filter, and exposure is the only one I want. So I'm going to bring the sharpness back to 0. Let's just double click in the middle there to bring up everything to 0, apart from the exposure. Click somewhere in the middle, click and drag outwards like so. And now we can add just a little bit of a vignette around the outside of the image. Something like that's good. Click OK, and then I'll add just a little bit of blur. So from the filter menu, we'll go to blur, and I'm going to use iris blur. And then once in here, we've got this little dialog box where we've got these controls in the center where we can control how much blur and where we want the blur to be positioned. So let's just stretch this out just a little bit. The dial in the center here controls how much blur we have, and then we control these little pins in the middle here. They control the feathering of how the blur goes inwards to the middle. So somewhere around about there is looking good, and then we'll click OK. So there you go, we've created our own piece of unique art. We've made a location that basically didn't exist. But the great thing is, because of the way we've done the retouching non-destructively, if we want to go back in and make any changes, we've always got the filters available to us. So we could maybe, let's say if we wanted to change the camera raw filter, I can just double click on the name of the camera raw filter. It brings me into camera raw. And then I could also then come in and change the look of that actual vignette, how much of that vignette I wanted to darken it a bit more, or maybe not quite so dark. Click OK and it sends me back. If I want to see all the other layers from the previous parts of the retouching, I just double click on the layer that contains the smart object icon on the bottom right. And when I double click on that, it then does a little bit of thinking and starts to bring back all the layers. And we can go all the way back in the retouching to go back right to the start of the image. So there you go, something completely different for this week, but hopefully it's given you the push to want to grab your camera and get out and create something that is totally different to what you normally would do, and create a picture that you'd like to see hanging on the wall in your home or in your office. There are so many benefits to doing this, so many hidden benefits. I mean, you're going to start using your camera in a different way, but also when it comes to the retouching side of things, you're going to find yourself using techniques that you maybe wouldn't do in Photoshop, so you're going to learn more and more and more. So it's a win-win situation. But hey, that's that's all for this week. So thanks for tuning in. Make sure you click on the subscribe button and also let others know about this video and also my YouTube channel and now the podcast, because obviously we're live now on the iTunes podcast store. But hey, for this week, that's all. I'll see you next time.